Yo, what is going on, America's History people? We have chapter 26 for you today of the 8th edition. This one is on the culture of the 1950s. Before we begin, it's shout out time. Shout out to Daquan and Mr. Dempsey's class, Egnor's class in Miramar, Florida. It sounds like an awesome place. I should go there sometime. I would enjoy the Florida weather. I'm stuck in Buffalo in like 20-degree weather. And Mr. Martell from Calmum High School. Thank you all so much for watching. The exam will be here soon, and best of luck to you all. All right, let's talk about post-war prosperity and the affluent society. So there are a couple organizations that were set up post-World War II to try to stabilize worldwide economies. And with the creation of the World Bank, and the World Bank was created to give loans to countries predominantly in the third world and those that were destroyed by the war. We also have the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and this was established to stabilize currencies around the world with the US dollar as the benchmark. Military-industrial complex, please make sure you know this bad boy. Super, super, super important, specifically mentioned in the new curriculum. This is a growth of industries that benefited from government contracts for military supplies. You see companies like Boeing and General Electric who are making large amounts of products and goods for the United States that would purchase for military purposes. Now, Eisenhower, in his farewell address a couple days before he left office, warned of the dangers of this in his farewell address. You could very well see Eisenhower's quote about the dangers of the military-industrial complex as a stimulus for either a short answer or a multiple choice question, as well as a possible DBQ. Now, military spending increasingly has consumed more of the nation's GDP since the end of World War II. What's partly responsible for this is the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik, this satellite, and here's a replica of Sputnik, that was launched and orbited the Earth, and this helped lead to the space race. The Soviet Union early on had an advantage in the space race. Now, the impact of Sputnik on the U.S. was that they passed the National Defense Education Act, which increased funding for education, especially in the fields of science and math. So the United States looked at itself, felt that they were behind, and began to increase funding for education. So let's talk about corporations. They grew in power and had a large share of their markets during the 1950s. And a theme that we saw with farmers in the late 19th century, which caused them to move to cities, really impacts factory workers during this time, and that is the idea of mechanization replacing factory workers, or replacing workers, specifically machines replacing factory workers. The affluent society, this argued that the poor were not the focus of politicians and economists, that they were essentially left out. And The Other America is a very influential book. It's by Michael Harrington, and this focused on the poor in America and helped influence LBJ's Great Society in 1960s, which we'll talk about in chapter 28. Okay, let's talk about consumers. The 1950s could very well be compared to the 1920s. We had new consumer products, specialty TV in the 1950s, and mass consumption as well. Now, the GI Bill was created to help soldiers that were returning from World War II, and it helped them by providing education opportunities for returning soldiers. Over 7 million veterans either attended college or some sort of trade school in the 1950s, which helped lead to a higher paying American workforce. The Veterans Administration, or the VA, was established that helped provide home loans for veterans, and we'll talk more about home ownership in a couple minutes. Now, for trade unions in the 1950s, union membership increased drastically in the 1940s, and income rose for many workers in the 1950s as well. And health insurance and pensions were provided through many union contracts that were collectively bargained. So many families began to purchase home and cars in the 1950s, and not just one car, they would purchase 2 cars. 25 million homes were purchased in 25 years between 1945 and 1970. That is insane. Most of these homes had TVs, which promoted consumer products, which in turn would cause an increase in consumer consumption. Now, television really became popular in the 1950s, as I talked about. Most TV shows focused on white, middle-class, suburban families where mothers were housewives. And you see shows like Leave It to Beaver, which here's a photo from, and also a title called Father Knows Best. Now, this image of families on the TV in the 1950s, again, was white, middle class. Mothers would stay home, and oftentimes there would be 2 children, maybe 3. Now, sticking with youth culture, teenagers were often targeted by advertisers to buy products, and there were a lot of teenagers during this time, as we'll see, so they're very influential. Movies would glorify young, rebellious men, most notably Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean. Rock and roll becomes familiar, which freaked a lot of parents out, and it really began with Alan Freed, a disc jockey from Cleveland, Ohio, who played race or black music over Cleveland Airways. And then shortly after, Elvis Presley comes along, and some of his songs were covers of black artists, and it really introduces this new style of music to mainstream America. We do have cultural dissenters, most notably the Beats, also referred to the Beatniks or the Beat Generation, and these were writers that criticized middle-class values and culture, and they were very similar to the Lost Generation of the 1920s, most notably F. Scott Fitzgerald. And here is a very well-known beatnik, Jack Kerouac, who wrote the book On the Road. So if you see a short answer question comparing the 1920s and the 1950s, this slide here in the previous slide is what you will really focus on. It's not just that there was a large amount of consumerism, it's also that there were dissenters. Don't forget about the Beats and the Lost Generation. Religion begins to kind of come back into focus in the 1950s on a large scale. We have Billy Graham, who was an influential evangelical preacher of the 1950s. He would travel the country. If you've ever read the book Unbroken, you'll see that he makes an appearance in the book. It's a fantastic book, by the way. True story. Check it out. It's amazing. You won't regret it. And he argued that materialism was not incompatible with living a moral life, that if you led a moral life, you deserve to have all the material products that you want. And in 1954, Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance as a way to show that the U.S. was not communist. All right, let's talk about the baby boom. This is the generation between 1945 and 1964. In the year 1964 is when the birth control pill was introduced. Now you're probably wondering, who is this woman on here? Well, she is a baby boomer. She was born right dab in the middle, and that is my mother. And we see this increase in birth rates due to drop in divorces. Notice the year 1945, that's right when the war ends, and lots of soldiers are returning home, and the economy and world is pretty stable, so people start to have families. So what is the impact of the baby boom generation? Well, tighter job markets began in the 1970s, and long term, we have healthcare and Social Security issues today. If you watch the news, you can't go a week without hearing something about Social Security and this baby boom generation. So many of them are either on or will be on Social Security, and there are issues, will it last? So it's about improving health and education. We have new medical advancements that reduce mortality rates, especially for children. The polio vaccine, the mid-1950s, by Dr. Jonas Salk. This dude invents it and gives it away for free. Is that a champ or what? I cannot believe some dude gives a vaccine away for free. I don't think that would ever happen today. Go out and invent a vaccine and prove me wrong, please. And then we have Dr. Benjamin Spock. He wrote a common sense book of baby child care, and he argued that mothers be available for their children. This is one of the most influential child rearing books of it. Okay, let's talk about suburbs. 1 out of 3 Americans were living in suburbs by the 1960s, and this was aided by cars and highways. Now, 2 things in particular that led to this were a dude by the name of William Levitt and the FHA. Well, William Levitt, he and his family owned a company, and they built houses. So they took these mass production techniques of Taylor and Ford and really applied them to houses. And they began to replicate similar houses and produce them very quickly. Shortly later, other suburbs began to adopt their techniques. Now, these were cheap houses. They were very similar styles, basically 4 or 5. And in this neighborhood and other neighborhoods like it, unfortunately, African Americans were excluded. So we see segregation still persisting in the 1950s and the 1960s. The FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, provided mortgages with little money down. When my wife and I bought our house about 8 years ago, we took out an FHA loan. So we only had to put like 5% down, I think it was, on the total value of our house, and the rest we'll pay over 30 years. And this in particular really helps increase home ownership on a large scale. Now, despite the Supreme Court's ruling, racial discrimination in housing persists. The Supreme Court basically said you cannot discriminate in housing, but unfortunately it happened anyway. So let's talk about Interstate Highways. This was created by the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. This was created under Eisenhower's administration, and there were 42,000 miles of highways. And this was the largest government works project in history up to that point. And part of the motivation was that it would aid in a nuclear attack. So if there was a large city you live in, say New York City or DC, you could hop on the highway and get out of there in a hurry. That is the idea behind it. Now, this is something I drive on several times a year, and I start way up here in Buffalo, and I drive 6.5 hours. So I did it once in 6 hours and 8 minutes, all the way down to Cincinnati. Don't tell my wife, she'll be really upset with me. And this helped lead to the growth of hotel and food industries throughout the United States as well. So speaking of food industries, we can't talk about the 1950s without talking about McDonald's and Ray Kroc. And again, this theme of using scientific management or improving production, he used Taylorism techniques to mass produce hamburgers. He bought the company from two brothers and then became a very wealthy individual. Sunbelt. Definitely know what the Sunbelt is. These are states that are located in the south and southwest portion of the United States. It basically goes from Virginia all the way down to Florida, continuing straight west past Texas, all those states over to California. And that area there, it's called the Sunbelt because it's very sunny down there. And this is where industries blossomed, especially military bases after World War II. And industries and military were drawn here due to warm weather and low taxes. And this is really a trend since World War II. We see an increase in population in Sunbelt states at the expense of northern, or what's sometimes referred to as Frost Belt states. And my state in New York has decreased significantly since the 1950s. As many whites moved to the suburbs, this is often referred to as white flight. African Americans moved to cities in large numbers. And unfortunately, some of these cities that they move into will have poor housing. Now, the Kerner Commission, which we'll talk about more in the next chapter, and here is Otto Kerner and President Lyndon Baines Johnson. This was a government commission that stated that the country is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The urban crisis, many African Americans that lived in cities lived in old apartment buildings and received low-paying jobs. There was this push for urban renewal to destroy some of these old buildings, and in doing so, it actually pushed many people out of their homes. It displaced over 1 million people. Urban immigrants began to come in large numbers, especially in 1943 with the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and many Mexicans from the Bracero program remained in the United States after it ended, officially in 1964, and Puerto Ricans, in part due to cheap airfares, left Puerto Rico and came to New York City. And at one point, there was a higher population in New York City than there was in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And after Fidel Castro gained power in Cuba in 1954, many Cubans fled to the United States, especially in Miami. All right, let's do a quick recap. We have the military-industrial complex. Absolutely know this bad boy. Specifically mentioned in the new curriculum. That Fluid America. What did that writing argue? The GI Bill. What was the purpose of it? What was the effects? Beatniks. That they were similar to the Lost Generation in that both criticized middle-class values. Short-term and long-term impacts of the baby boom generation. The 1950s family in quotes. What was it? The ideal family, and what was the role of women during that time? Levittown and the FHA describe both and be able to talk about how that contributed to an increase in home ownership. Interstate highways. Why were they built? What was the impact? Growth of the Sunbelt. First of all, what the heck is the Sunbelt? And white flight and its impact on cities. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you right back here for Chapter 27 when we talk about who I think is one of the most interesting people of the 20th century, Malcolm X, we'll talk about. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the section below, and I will see you back here soon. Best of luck, and have a good day.